But he'll be able to answer your questions in just about any topic. If you want to ask him about how engines work, how cars run, if you want to ask him about Middle East history, if you have any questions on English literature, classical music, Neapolitan music, I found that Lincoln is well-read and well-educated, and if you can stump him in a question this afternoon, my hat's off to you.
I have to repeat the comment. Introductions can really set you up for a fall. and we have these afternoon meetings very often, not quite every week. I've never counted out how many weeks, but it's more than half of the weeks. But others in our religious liberty department at the union level too, like Charles, are travelling around. And we nearly always have the service in the morning, and then in the afternoon a question and answer on religious liberty. And yeah, we've sometimes among ourselves joked that they're the same questions, not the same wording, but the same issues come up all the time. And I made the mistake a couple of weeks ago of making that comment, and then someone promptly asked me two questions in a row that I really didn't know the answer to. So the answers that I'm not likely to either to know or to be as comfortable with are some of the more complex legal issues, and Charles certainly can speak to that. I don't want to talk too long before we have the questions, and we can have questions as long as you want before you start drifting away, but I'll give you a little part of what's going on to sort of set the scene. And I have different preoccupations, and today you got one of them this morning. I'll freely admit there were two things that informed what I said this morning. My father's passing made me look again at the central element of our faith, Jesus Christ. It was very helpful for me, I think, to think on that and to see his commitment right till the last minute. And then that joined in my talk with, I'm trying to think of a mild word, just my anger basically at reading a magazine, Adventist Forum. And there's other worse magazines floating around, but I've just been impressed lately that a lot of what passes for dialogue within the Adventist Church in other eras would have been seen as disbelief. We need to be careful that while we're an open church, we don't disfellowship, or we do disfellowship. We don't excommunicate, and we're free human beings. To indulge in doubt and dissension is not really very profitable. But religious liberty has always been of interest to Seventh-day Adventists, and there's always been threats always around the world, but even in this country that's defended religious liberty as a byproduct of its history, with so many people escaping religious persecution in the old world, not just before the founding of this country. The Pilgrims were not the only group that came across for religious reasons. After World War II, many people came across from regimes that would restrict their religious faith and have helped informed our commitment to religious freedom. This country is important for how it sees religious freedom, and there's always been threats. It's never been, as at least the grade school history books like to tell you, an unqualified bastion of freedom. We've had to fight for it. We've had to defend the rights even here. But all of that said, I believe at the moment there is a shift that's almost unprecedented, but I need to qualify it. There are two elements from the Constitution that we use all the time in Liberty magazine to talk about religious freedom. Two halves of the First Amendment, or actually two halves of half of the First Amendment. The First Amendment deals with free speech, but as far as religion, that half says Congress shall make no law establishing religion, nor prevent the free exercise thereof. So we're talking about establishment issues and free exercise issues. And if you read Liberty, I hope you understand that. And if you haven't till now, that's what we're talking about. And a lot of these court cases, Supreme Court cases, in fact, all of them relating to religion can be divided into those two halves. But my way of describing it right now is that there are serious inroads being made on the religious freedom issue, or on religious issues, But I don't believe in the United States currently there are major attacks on your free exercise of religion. Doesn't mean there are not attacks, because there's always been attacks. Let me tell you, if you live down the Bible Belt, with all the Southern Baptists and so on, and you want Sabbath accommodation, you're much more likely to have troubles there, because the society look unfavorably on your religious view that's out of the norm. And it doesn't matter what legal protection you have, practically speaking, you will have problems. That has been, and it will remain. But the changes that we're seeing lately, I believe, have almost totally to do with establishment. And that's the byproduct of what you know from reading the newspapers in the last 10, 15 years, the so-called religious right, the moral majority, however you want to describe it, a politically active religious faction are trying to reclaim society, which is fine, and government for their faith view. And there's a half-truth even in that that's fine. Seventh-day Adventists, when Ellen White was alive, were very much involved in social issues that derive from their religious point of view. The temperance movement was advanced with vigor, and as Ellen White said at one stage, in a reference that someone discussed with me at lunchtime, and I couldn't remember the reference, but it's a regular statement. She says, it is so important to vote on the temperance issue. And she was talking about for prohibition, so important that you should even vote on Sabbath. And that just flies against everything that we know about what we should do on Sabbath. This was very important that Seventh-day Adventists put their faith into action. But the religious right that we see now have crossed a far bigger line. Dr. Dobson, if you see him lately on television, you'll know that he's unabashedly now a political operative. He legally has cut his connections. He still has a connection, but he's legally distanced himself from focus on the family so that he can be blatantly a political activist. And they're advancing a political agenda to gain control on issues that are not just informed by their faith, they're inseparable from their faith, are designed to create a new structure in this country that will support their form of religion. And the Establishment Clause is all about support. It says Congress shall make no law supporting religion, establishing religion. And this administration, the very first thing that the president did when he and his administration took over was to rush through, at first legislatively, but when that was going too slow, by executive order, rush through the faith-based initiative, which is a direct funding of church activity that is overtly church-oriented, not just a church acting as a proxy to do a civil program. And that set the tone for much of what this administration would do and their supporters would still like to do. And I believe that the shorthand way to look at this is that this is proceeding on a pace, but while they're doing that, they are not inclined, both as an extension of the logic of what's going on, nor just since their business at hand is to do that, they're not particularly inclined to seek legislation and do things that would restrict you as a minority. I see no evidence that they're trying to exclude other religious groups, except perhaps Islam. And there was a little blip at the beginning of the faith-based initiative when someone made a public comment about who would be getting this money. Would the Nation of Islam get it? Which is the black Muslims group. And I remember Jerry Falwell, I think it was, threw his hands up literally. By no means, they shouldn't be getting the money. No, it has to be acceptable Catholic, Protestant, Christian organizations. But, that was just a little wind into where they're thinking. We basically have this conundrum, unequaled efforts are being made to move across the line on establishment, but very little is happening on free exercise. And in fact, if anything, I think free exercise has been defended fairly well. Remember, not too long ago, those of you that have paid attention, the Supreme Court upheld on a case that was brought by the Jehovah's Witnesses the rights of them, and by extension you, to go door to door soliciting money and to witness for your church. Things like that are allowed. And in most every case, when those things are challenged, whether it's the right of Christian students to have a club or a meeting on after hours in schools. Good News Club, I think, was the case. That was allowed. I don't see a practical restriction, but the establishment is moving apace. And then at the same time that I alluded to this morning, in the larger social dynamic that we're in, with the catalyst of 9/11 and the things that have followed through, with extraordinary laws and procedures to deal with this apparent threat. It's real, but I think the threat is being sexed up, to use a word that they've applied to the rationale for war. Many of those things have ramifications on, of course, civil liberties, but have ramifications on religious liberty. And we should be aware of what this signals. And also, Seventh-day Adventists, indeed all Christians that read Jesus' words where he says, the day will come when people will hand you over believing, to kill you, believing they're doing the very work of God. I never saw how that could happen in the United States, but we've crossed the line. If you are identified as an enemy, a terrorist, every man's hand will be against you. And you can say fine, because you probably yourself would do everything necessary if you thought someone was a terrorist. But remember, as the Patriot Act has shown, for too many people that have analysed it, all too many people that have analysed it, it is not clear legally who or what a terrorist is. After the fact, we know all too well. But it devolves very easily into somebody that the government says is a terrorist, usually because they're opposed in some way or another to the goals and the aims and the character that government wants to establish for itself. I want to give you just one tool, I think, to explain why there's this sudden shift, though, in church-state things. And as far as some things that have flown over or rolled over from 9/11. We can talk about that in the question and answer. But the First Amendment and the Constitution, which mostly doesn't deal with religion, except for the First Amendment, there's just a clause that says no religious tests for public office. And generally, that's not a problem. Mitt Romney notwithstanding, and JFK, of course, that was an issue with him. Why? You've got to ask the question, why are we now having problems with the Constitution? Why is it not restraining people, and why did it restrain them in the past? And the answer that I think most explains it, and Adventists should understand, is there's been a change in how the Catholic Church relates to this whole dynamic. It's an easy historical exercise to show that even at the time of the framing of the Constitution, there were religionists who wanted improper control of the government, improper involvement, wanted funding. There were heavy debates about whether even church school teachers should have been paid by the state. All of those things went through and through. But in the end, it was decided on the federal level, and then definitively by the end of the Civil War, when federal laws were applied fully to the states, it was decided that churches would not have state funding. Why was that? You only have to look at history to know that while people wanted it for their various reasons, this country, as an overwhelmingly Protestant country, shared an aversion to allowing Catholic power and prestige to rise on this continent. At time, it was not well executed. There's been some reprehensible incidents in the United States, lynchings and riots and all sorts of things against Roman Catholics. Even the Ku Klux Klan that should live in infamy had as an equal plank in their strange beliefs as to the racism. It was anti-Catholicism because they wanted a white Protestant America. And that has continued right up till, at the very least, the Kennedy election. And even a bit beyond that. but something's changed. And I think the best way to describe that change is in the election of 2000. Remember, among many other crazy things, that election, and since then, now President Bush spoke at Bob Jones University. And Senator McCain tried to embarrass him by making a big deal about him speaking at Bob Jones University, which is a hardcore, old-time Protestant institution with some very retrograde social policies, to be sure, but their doctrine was hardcore Protestant. And it worked in the media. There was a lot of fuss. It was said that Bob Jones's view that the Pope is the Antichrist and so on is thoroughly marginal, thoroughly out of the mainstream. And that should have been a wake-up call for Protestants. Then it went even further. And in defending him, Chuck Colson, one of the leaders of the religious right, defended the president's right to speak there, which is good. But then he said this, and to me this tells the whole story. He said, in truth, this is an exact quote that I've memorized, in truth, the gulf between Catholics and Protestants created by the Reformation has been bridged, and today we stand as the largest single religious political bloc in America. Once you know that, once you realize that that has formed before your very eyes in the last few decades, you realize that why would they keep this wall of separation standing and operative? Of course not. And if you notice now that Protestants also, but Catholics very vigorously, the Pope particularly, are constantly hammering away at the enemy being secular humanists. Secularism is the enemy now. And when secularism is the enemy, religion needs to join together, reclaim society, reassert control of the government, and deal with that enemy. And if you oppose that, you are a secularist and an anti-religionist, and more, it's even been said you are a terrorist. I've heard it said. The example that I give often, because it's almost comical, but it happened, the Reverend Jerry Falwell and I always forget this guy's name, Al Sharpton, were on a TV program debating something, and they got onto abortion, and they had a little difference on its priority, not what they thought about abortion. And Falwell turned to Sharpton for differing with him, and he said, "You, for holding that view," he said, "you are not a Christian, you are not an American, and you are a terrorist sympathizer." And in this post 9/11 time, we know that you're likely to be, not always, but I mean, that sort of a determination, especially by government, means that you have little protection against being dragged off in the darkness and not being heard from again, at least legally. Most of the legal protections that we have really have been suspended if you are determined to be a terrorist. So the stakes are very, very high, but they've changed because of a changed attitude between Catholics and Protestants. And remember what Ellen White says, and I haven't recited this for a while, but there's that famous statement where she says that when the leading churches of the United States, uniting on such points of doctrine as are held by them in common, shall move upon the government to support, sustain their institutions and support their decrees, and we're halfway there, they're wanting to sustain the institution. She says, then Protestant America will have formed an image to the Roman hierarchy, and civil penalties against dissenters will inevitably follow. I believe we're well into that process, which was given to us under inspiration, but it's a logical one. You know how things work. And this is describable politically. There were political differences between Protestants and Catholics that kept a legal statute operative because of a shared fear, or a fear by the Protestants of what would happen. Now they have a shared enemy, so they are allies against secularism, and they no longer want that wall. And I go to any number of meetings where I hear Protestant activists make statements to the effect that there is no wall. The First Amendment never mandated any separation of church and state. They literally spit on it. And they repeat it often enough, and a lot of the populace start to believe that, well, this is manufactured by the judiciary in the 60s and 70s. It's not what our founding fathers wanted. We've got not Abraham Lincoln, we've got George Washington, kneeling there before a battle and the light from heaven shining on him, and he held up the Bible, all sort of thing that Parson Weems and other legend makers were inclined to do in the early days. But it's a very satisfying, self-serving rewriting of history to support the new assumption that they're making. And there are many examples that we'll probably talk about in the next few minutes that you can see of this, but this explains it, this describes it. As far as the Catholic Church, I'll conclude. I take whole talks on different documents that they've come out with, but I just want to tell you one recent thing that I think is very illuminating. The Pope of Rome, Pope Benedict, who was previously Cardinal Ratzinger, previously in charge of the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, the Holy Inquisition, and wrote most of the documents that appeared under his predecessor. Very important documents, starting with one you do know, Dies Domini, explaining Sunday observance with all the proof texts of the Sabbath that we know. But he gave a speech September 12 of last year that I know you know about, but I guarantee, well, let's ask for a show of hands. Has anyone read that speech that he gave September 12 last year? Well, Charles is, I'm glad he did, but beyond him, one person. And that's one more than I expected, because there were riots all over the world, in Muslim areas particularly, after that speech. And yet those same Muslim leaders admitted freely they had not read the speech. He started his speech, which was delivered in Regensburg, Germany, near his hometown, at the university that he taught at when it was founded some years ago. But more importantly, this was Regensburg was a center, one of the several sites of the Diet, so-called, or the meeting of the Holy Roman Empire. Remember the Diet of Worms, where Luther spoke? Well, Regensburg was one of those main centers, and Regensburg was a main center of Protestantism in the early Reformation, and it curiously was one of the main centers where the Counter-Reformation was launched in Europe. So a significant place for him to give this speech. And of course, September 12, one day after the memorial of September 11, I don't think that was an accident. And the Pope gave as an example a dialogue between a Byzantine emperor and a Persian Muslim who was representing an army that was surrounding Constantinople to conquer it. And they had a little debate about the role of violence in religion. And the Pope got into trouble because he quoted this Byzantine emperor's statement that, a question, he says, "Tell me what Muhammad brought to religion that was new other than violence." So since that was so offensive, Islam goes violent on. I mean, that's a whole different story. But I don't think the Pope expected such a reaction, because it was a historical reality. That conversation took place. And the rest of his speech had nothing to do with Islam, because violence is put on the table. Then the Pope describes, quite logically and methodically, how, to his satisfaction at least, Christianity, which once had violent propensities. Now, Adventists should know that it didn't. Early Christianity was non-violent. The Roman Empire, before Constantine, persecuted them quite vigorously, and it was often remarked that how passive the Christians were. They would go to the lions unresisting. And that the turn took place when Rome adopted Christianity. Then it became quite militant. But according to the Pope, Christianity once had violent propensities, but under Rome, it adopted what he calls a Hellenistic or a Greek overlay of logic and rationality. Now, we could call it something else, but he defines it as Hellenism. It became logical, rational, and that has protected it against visceral, unthinking, violent activities based on people like the Muslims who will read something in the Holy Book about slitting throats and they go off and slit throats. Not acceptable in the modern world. Then the rest of the speech is listing three main de-Hellenizing attacks on this rational center of Christianity. The last two, without going into them in detail, are basically variations on what we also would have problems with, secular humanism. Although how those would predispose Christianity to violence escapes me. But it's well known that this Pope is opposed to secular humanism. The very first reason that he gives, this first attack on Christianity by de-Hellenizing it, is this. He said, the Reformers, by accepting the principle of sola scriptura, removed Christianity from this rational, protective, Hellenizing element. And in a post-9/11 world, in a world where there's a war on terrorism, in a world where radical Islam, by its own statements, wants to sweep through whole societies and harass the West and form a global coalition and answer to what they see as a crusade for our time, he has to mean something by that. And what I think the Pope is intending is not to chase Christianity, Protestantism away. I think he's sure enough of himself that by defining Rome with this cultural overlay, not doctrinal, and he doesn't use the word, but they often do elsewhere, the authority, the tradition, the safety of the Mother Church, I think he intends to scare them into the fold. They will not want to be sitting out there as akin to the terrorists or to radical Islam. And the efforts that we've seen since then sort of underscore this. And it was interesting what the Pope was willing to do to placate Islam, even including praying toward Mecca. I never thought I'd live to see such a thing. The last thing I'll say, because I think it's more meaningful than just in this single context, when Charles and I were in Rome for a conference at the time that the Pope was in Turkey mending bridges, maybe I shouldn't use that term ahead of time, but fixing things up, the Vatican spokesman on TV, I heard in Italy, in Italian, because I knew by then what he meant, but in English, on English language stations, the spokesman said something that I think was most significant and asked what was going on, why was the Pope going there, and so on. He said, we have been building bridges for years, he said. Now is the time to cross those bridges. I've never heard the Vatican say such a thing before. As Bert Beach, who I talk a lot to and used to be head of the Religious Liberty Department at the GC, he correctly points out that Rome takes the long view. You know, this is an institution that's existed many, many hundreds of years. They can wait. They can bide their time. And Bert just told me the other day, a new pope doesn't try to do something within his pontificate. He's happy enough to build on the other and leave a legacy. Where even in the Adventist church, often a president wants to be defined by some new initiative. They're not necessarily working that way. They can be patient. Ellen White says that, you know, that they're patiently working toward their long-term plan. But I've never heard them say before, this is the payoff time. Something is afoot. I truly believe it, even if it's more years than I might imagine. It's going to happen quickly. They're ready for the final act in unifying the Church of England, and I'm sure you've read something on that. They're ready for the final act in some sort of accommodation with Islam. And it was surprising to me, and now I remember what I promised you, that when we met with this Palestine Liberation Organization representative just this last week, I asked him a few leading questions, and I asked him something that no one else seems to remember, but that in the waning years of Pope John Paul II's pontificate, he went to the Middle East, and before he went to Israel, or proper, he went to Ramallah, to the headquarters of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and met with Arafat, and they signed a document. And it was a document that said that the status of Jerusalem cannot be settled unless both the Pope and Arafat are involved. So I asked this man, I said, well, I remember that signing. I said, but Arafat's dead now. And I said, does that mean it's passé, or was this binding between the PLO or the Palestinian Authority and the Pope? And he said something very interesting. He says, I knew he was a friend of Arafat in his inner circle. He said, I was there I remember that signing, and he said, it is a binding document. We know that the Holy Father, as he called him, is intimately involved in all of these negotiations. Now and then you get a little look behind the scenes. Things are stirring, and it's not illegitimate for Rome to be involved in such things, but it's most inappropriate from a church-state point of view, and it's most significant from a prophetic point of view. And I think Adventists should realize that everything is coming together rapidly. But I won't belabor things and open it up for questions now, and you can take it any way you want. This would be an unusual audience if you didn't have a lot of questions, and I'll try to keep the questions shorter, and I'll try to get Charles to come up and answer some of them. Maybe all of them if he wants to. Sorry? Yeah, there's a microphone down here if you come to it.
Okay, I have a question. I was wondering, you mentioned the Nation of Islam, and Adventists are known, especially in prophecy, we are known to call the beast in Revelation chapter 13. In other words, we see them as United States. I've always wondered since 9/11, how come we haven't been targeted by the United States government, being our prophecy claims as the beast? Why?
Well, that's what I was saying this morning. Targeting is the wrong word, but I do believe if we were more vocal and more clear about what we still hold, that there would be some ramifications from that. But you need to be aware that just as in the Vietnam War, when government agencies were routinely monitoring and infiltrating any number of groups, there's been directives put out since 9/11 that they routinely are infiltrating and observing many, if not most, church operations and programs now. So they're watching. And it's not a seditious thing yet to say those things, but I believe our way will be compounded a bit as it's clear what we believe on that. So the question we have to face, we believe this, we see it happening in front of us, do we just keep quiet about it, or do we become more vocal? And it needs to be done carefully in a way that doesn't put us personally against this country. We should, as all good aliens, I know what it's like to be an alien. I came from another country. An alien is not released from civil obligation. You have to live a more exemplary life because you get into trouble quicker. So we're citizens of God's kingdom, but we're to be good citizens in any parameter of the country that does not counter God's principle. But we have to speak about what God has said. And I think it's a moment of truth that so far we haven't answered very well. It's put out and around in some publications. But I think most Adventists themselves are willfully blind on what the meaning of Revelation 13 is. Since 9/11 and the glorious militarism of some of our adventures, the conservative element of our church is rallying and feeling triumphant about this. And it's not that we shouldn't be supportive of our country's aims, but there's a thin line between that and letting it hijack your spiritual commitment.
We have evangelists like Doug Batchers who openly speak against this thing. And I've always wondered, why is it that, I haven't seen anything happening here?
Well, it's not illegal here. but as Ellen White says, when the time of trouble comes, things that we've said and done will be quoted back to us. Things are being watched. And it's amazing to me that in this tricky time, we have access to the government and good contacts with the government better than we've ever had, even as the hazard of our opinions being known has never been higher. But we shouldn't let that, my real point is that don't let that restrain us. I think there is well, it's not so much a fear of not saying these things. I think there's an over-readiness to wave the flag and, rah, 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 we're with it all. Where we shouldn't be with this. It's not that we shouldn't be doing anything contrary to the state to stop it, other than speak morally to the situation. But how could Adventists be thrilled to their being by all this militarism and these wars? It's just a contradiction to our principles. Our church came into being very shortly before the Civil War. Which, if ever there was a case for citizenry to be occupied and to get moving with it, there would be that one. Ellen White and the pioneers were quite plain that we should not be involved, even though she said that it was basically a punishment on the South for the slavery. There's no record of Ellen and the other pioneers rallying Adventists to get with the cause, good patriots, move out with the battalions. It was the reverse. That's precisely when we developed our non-combatancy views. And our guard is down now. I had a good conversation with an elderly gentleman before, I don't think's here, who'd been in the military. His son was in the military, and it was inspiring to hear his family stories. But it just reminded me that our whole church in this division is in a hazardous position to the extreme, with many young people in the military, and essentially no young person gets full Sabbath accommodation in the military. None. So by encouraging Adventist young people to go into the military, you are guaranteeing that they will compromise their principles of living for the Sabbath and other Adventist particulars. Think about it. It's not just a dangerous situation, guaranteed that they will not get accommodation. It's not like in the Vietnam War when we'd worked out the white coats and a non-combatancy status. That's all gone with the draft. Volunteer army, they contract with the government to do its bidding. And regardless of whether you think this particular war is just or not, just on the level of practicing Christian commitment, we have a problem. And hardly anything is said. Thankfully, our chaplaincy department, I believe, are in the process of re-examining how they get the word out. Because in the past, I think they basically were leading the cheer group. But these are morally dangerous times, I believe. And as I study the dynamic that will lead to some sort of conflict for all of us between not so much the state, but between society and state laws and so on, I realize that the real test, or the real important part of the test, is not at that moment when some gross law suddenly faces you. It's the build-up to it. If you don't see it coming, at that moment, you're very unlikely to even have a commitment on it. You can slide right into it. And I believe we've gone far enough into some very troubling developments that if we are not troubled already, we never will. Never will be. Any other questions?
How do we speak more?
Maybe on the microphone.
I'm not sure if this is the correct question, but how do you speak morally to a situation without getting mixed up with the whole religious right that's out there that's very vociferous about various moral issues here in America?
Well, we do have common cause with them on certain areas. And going back to Ellen White, on the temperance movement, she and others in the Adventist Church united quite freely with the so-called, they weren't called them, but now the so-called moral majority Christian right or whatever. She actually was involved on the temperance cause with people on the Lord's Day Alliance that were pushing for, not the Lord's Day Alliance, they were, but I'm trying to think of the group, anyhow, there was a coalition that were pushing for Sunday observance. And they also had a moral position on alcohol. And very often Ellen White would speak at their meetings on temperance, but yet oppose them on their Sunday legislation. I don't think there's anything wrong with having common cause with the religious right on abortion, say, and being adamantly opposed to their methods on that and many other things, trying to do it through political, not so much, there's nothing wrong with political activity per se. Every one of us as citizens has rights, as Paul was quite clear on, as his rights as a citizen. You have rights, indeed obligations, to participate in the process. But to go the next step as the religious right do, it's really two steps. Be quite willing to seek through legislation to have elements of your belief structure imposed on everyone else, and also to well, I guess it's part and parcel of it to rethink or to restructure the government in the image of your religious beliefs. That's wrong. That's exactly the same direction as the Sharia law in Islamic republics. But why shouldn't we speak out? It's just troubled me for a long time that on abortion, on well, now they've belatedly picked it up, but on the environment, on some of the inequalities of poverty, and so on. Adventists should speak to these things. We shouldn't major in it. We're not to have a social gospel to the exclusion of our proclamation, but we should speak with a moral voice. But be careful of moral values. In the last few elections, there's been a lot of talk about morality. Morality, as John Bunyan pointed out, without spirituality is one of the most damnable, pernicious elements of religion that man ever got a grip on. Morality, to repeat what I said this morning, led the Germans down the track into Hitler's private hell. They spoke moral values. And I meant to say it this morning, but the churches were so subverted in Germany by the claim of the nationalist socialists to morally rejuvenate the country that they used to routinely have the cross. We don't have the cross, and nor should we necessarily, but they'd have the cross at the back of the church, and superimposed on it would be the swastika. And I heard on the video that I watched the other day, church leaders there say unambiguously that their religion called upon them to support National Socialism. And then Hitler, in a speech, said what I never thought he'd said, that he said the bedrock principle of National Socialism was its religious faith. Things can be subverted very easily, but less easily if spirituality is what you're seeking to develop in the society, not quote, moral values that can be code language for a religio-political agenda that's quite devoid from spiritual renewal. Any more questions?
Oh, as we were talking before about your dad's books that I've read, two of them, one being 2B1, and I believe the other one was God's DNA, but he points out there how we should be leading out in temperance now against abortion and the tobacco and alcohol, so that when the temperance movement and Sunday laws join together, our neighbors will say, but they were always against smoking. They were having stop smoking classes and cooking schools, and they were moral, healthy people. It's the Sunday thing they're against, not the temperance part. We should be known for that already. And he makes that made very strongly in the books there that I read. Also, about the swastika on the cross, I think a version of that now, as I mentioned to you also, but on the news, on the internet, I saw an article of a man who lost or has reduced his church because a lot of people left. He had a big mega church, I think it was in Minnesota, and he had stood up against a video that they were showing in the church to start church every Sunday. It showed 3 crosses and F-16s flying over the 3 crosses, as if our military and our religion are the same. And if you're against that, you're not an American, you're not a patriot, you can't be in our church. And he stood up against that, to his credit, and lost a lot of people. Our American history is full of people being persecuted for believing differently. In Virginia, there's a whole trail of history that I could take you on, because I've been on it several times, driving, and all the plaques around Virginia upholding, like Baptists who were persecuted, for example, for dunking people and not wanting to pay taxes to support the state church there that they didn't believe in. One man in particular, John Leland, I don't know if you're... We
had an article in Liberty on him recently.
Oh, wonderful.
You should read Liberty.
I should. Well, I do on occasion,
please.
but...
Maybe I can get my ad in here. This is a little bit outside the campaign, so I didn't belabor it this morning, but during the campaign, which hopefully you responded well to, we call on Adventists to give money and names. They don't have to give names, but if they have names, and if not, we'll supply them. But money to send the magazine to our target audience, the senators, the congressmen, the lawyers, the judges, and so on, these thought leaders. But I have a burden that you should be reading it. It's not that I'm not bold enough to say that if you read Liberty, you know everything about religious liberty, but I can almost guarantee, if this man is an exception since he's knowledgeable, if you're not reading Liberty, by definition, you're probably not that involved or conversant, or worse, maybe have religious liberty views that are more flavored by the Dobsons and the others of the world. So really, it's for $5, $6 a year, you can sort of buy into this. And please think about it, maybe right now, and sign up for it, but next time it rolls around, don't miss the opportunity to get this for yourself.
Maybe you already pointed this out in that article, but Leland, he was born here in Massachusetts, moved to Virginia, helped influence the young James Madison prior to becoming president, that the Baptists in that area are being persecuted for believing differently. There's a little park down there called, I lived about 5 miles from this park for about 10 years, called the Madison Leland Park. And they have a little relief sculpture of Madison there, and on the plaque it states that he was an advocate of separation of church and state, and this was put there in the 50s, by the Goshen Society up here. They thought so much of that incident of him influencing Madison that they went down there, built this little park to commemorate the meeting of John Leland and Madison. And there's a lot of quotes by Leland, one of them being that is just so practical, we should put it on the front of Liberty maybe. The government should have no more to do with the principles of religion than it does mathematics. The government should have no more to do with the principles. I think that
was in the article, but I know it was in an article I read the other day. I was just this last week. I read another article by Leland.
If the government tells us 1 + 1 makes 3, does it make it so?
Yeah.
If they tell us when and how to worship, does it make it so? It doesn't. And
well, it's true, and thank you.
Sure.
The Baptist connection is very much there on how we have the First Amendment and a whole attitude toward religion. And remember, this wall of separation terminology came about because the Baptists, the Danbury Baptists, sent a letter to Thomas Jefferson thanking him for his stance on religious freedom and wanting to know if they would be protected. And in commenting specifically on his own Virginia statute, but which was just a shadow of the federal Constitution provision, he said that this was designed to erect a wall of separation between church and state, and that's what they wanted to hear. That's what Leland, and he wasn't even unique in that. Baptists, that was their position. Not today. Baptists have been divided up several ways, and it's a minority of the Baptist coalition that still insists on separation of church and state. But there's a great story of how the Baptists have stood for it for the years. Yeah, I know. Well, maybe we can get it to you, because I know from experience the people behind you probably won't hear. We're kind of stuck with a short cord. It won't go any further than this.
I actually can speak fairly loudly anyway. In the last appointment to the Supreme Court by this president, we then moved to a majority of 5. We then moved to a majority of 5. Not on.
Is it switched? Talk loud, I guess.
Is that any? Okay. With the last appointment to the Supreme Court, we then moved to a majority of 5 Roman Catholics on the Supreme Court. And I just wanted to know what the conversation was around liberty and around the GC when that took place, because not only do we have the Patriot Act that destroys most of our freedoms, but we now have a Supreme Court that is the majority. Our first...
Remember what I said about the Constitution. Apart from the First Amendment, there's one other religious clause, and it says no public test for religious office. I think they meant it, although it occurs to me that they also gave inalienable rights to human beings at the time that they were was it about a third or a quarter of the population were slaves. So they probably didn't. She's worried that now 5 out of the 9 Supreme Court justices are Roman Catholic. So I was just reminding everyone that the Constitution, other than the First Amendment, where I gave those 2 clauses, says no religious test for public office. You can say they were cynical about it, but I'm sure that they meant it in theory, even though in practice they were clearly more troubled if Catholics got into position. But it's not a good line for us to take today to object per se to 5 out of 9 being Catholic. That's I hope, we don't necessarily mean it that way, but that's the only way it can come across, that we're prejudiced against Catholics per se. Remember that right now, Roman Catholics are divided several ways. There have always been the nominal ones. There's the Mel Gibson type that believe in pre-Vatican II that are hardline. There are others that have a very open view that. And as well as their political affiliation. So at the moment, I don't think it means much of anything. When the political Catholic and Protestant coalition gains power and they start to dictate certain things, then it suddenly could be seen a great hazard. We got a little insight into that during the 2004 presidential election. Candidate, I must be getting tired, Candidate Kerry, a Roman Catholic, made the right statements himself about religious freedom and so on. But the Roman Catholic Church came on very strong, and top bishops made comments that they made a mistake with President Kennedy not forcing him to do the church's dictates, and that they would not make that same mistake twice about Kerry. Well, that's a danger sign that if the church is willing to pressure their members on their particular agenda, then if he was like they tried to say, which was probably always false, that he was wishy-washy, then you got problems. So if there was a big issue and the battle lines were clearly drawn on this religious coalition, 5 out of 9 would be a fatal flaw. But that's down the track a bit, and I'm not sure to this day that the Supreme Court is a major part of the problem. I just think we're looking in the wrong direction. And remember what Ellen White says about the onset of Sunday laws. She says that the people clamor for this to their legislators. That's where it comes from. And when that happens, I would expect this present Supreme Court to sign off on it. So there's the fatal flaw, if you like. But I just believe most people have it all wrong about the Supreme Court. They believe Tom DeLay and others who viciously attacked the courts, particularly the Supreme Courts, and they've said that it's acting as a legislative body. Their ability to act legislatively in a de facto sense is limited because, first of all, they take what comes to them. And then there are many ramifications on that. They're just giving a thumbs up or a thumbs down on the legality of what comes to them. And clearly, there are ramifications, as on the Texas homosexuality thing. Without having heard all of their discussions, it seems to me sort of obvious that they were trying to defend privacy issues, which go way beyond sexual activity. But in defending privacy issue, they had the huge unintended consequence of just giving open go on homosexual behavior. But they got caught in the middle. Every time, though, that they've had the ability to pass it out, the Supreme Court have threaded a pretty safe thing, like on the display of the Ten Commandments. Was it last year? The years go by so quick, or the year before. They said that one that had been there for many, many years was okay because it was sort of settled, it was under sort of a public, non-denominational sort of religion, but one that had been put there provocatively in the short term on public grounds could not be. So they try to thread a middle ground, but they're not legislators. They're not where things initiate. They don't initiate things. On rare instances, obviously, you can look at, they gave a huge help on segregation with school busing and things like that. But I just think it's wrong for Seventh-day Adventists to make too much of the fact that there are so many Catholics on the Supreme Court, there's so many Catholics, and you think it's just the Supreme Court. That same proportion applies in the Senate and the Congress. There are massive amounts of Roman Catholics in major positions. They way outnumber any other single religious organization. They're not more than Protestants, but they're way more than any single Protestant organization. But we don't turn that back by crying foul. We have to make sure that the system works as designed, and that we constantly raise our voice for the separation of church and state. If that's adhered to, it doesn't really matter whether they're Muslims or Calathumpians. And there are Muslims coming in now. That was a big fuss recently. A Muslim swearing on, I think he swore on the Quran, didn't he?
How you doing? I just have a quick question about as far as us being Seventh-day Adventists, to what extent do we go with the division of church and state? I know, I personally believe in it, and I know as a church we should, but for instance, on the Congress, the Senate, we have chaplains, including someone from our own denomination. Us as a church, what are your views on that? I'm very confused, I would have to say, about all that.
I have private views that would probably get me into trouble, but James Madison was very insistent on it, that having a chaplain was not right. They had some debates in setting all this in motion, and on the margins, some things I believe went the wrong way. But at this late stage, no open harm comes from it. But yes, narrowly speaking, that puts the lie to the separation of church and state. That in that regard, that's not good. And we have the funny situation right now where there's an Adventist chaplain in the Senate and a Roman Catholic chaplain in the Congress, in the House. So at least we have balance. And Barry Black's doing a very good job. I'm sure of that. His function is not wrong, but Madison was most insistent that this really should not have been allowed. But when Liberty Magazine was begun, when our church began its Seventh-day Adventist work, they didn't have a long description of what they were trying to do, and I'm trying to remember the exact wording, but it was pretty much to the effect that they would fight anything and everything that broke down the principle of separation of church and state. That was the be-all and the end-all of our public proclamation of religious liberty. What I was trying to do this morning was remind us that we have a higher spiritual understanding of religious liberty. We are free, not because the state says it, but because God freed us, gave us a free state and freed us from the power of sin. So we're into proclamation. And I believe religious liberty can't be distinguished from proclaiming the three angels' messages. It's talking about God. It's telling God's story, the gospel. But in dealing with the government in the United States, it's set up its own model, which is a very safe principle and easily extracted from the Bible, particularly the New Testament, that as Jesus said, what's Caesar is Caesar's and what's God is God's. And Jesus said, if my kingdom were of this world, my followers would fight for me. We were talking about war before. We're not called to any holy battle here, except a spiritual battle to proclaim Jesus. And the state can't make those sort of claims upon us. I have views that are probably inherently revolutionary, not in practice, because we're not called to take up arms or either literally or figuratively as political operatives, but we're called to proclaim the transcendence of God's kingdom and the limited role of secular power. But not perjure myself. I was going to make a comment about Paul's comments about the authorities wielding not the sword in vain, but
It's probably not a big issue to you, but I think we as Adventists somewhat get confused between the political view and the judicial system. And I think the comments that were being made here were comments relating to the judicial system. And we as Adventists get confused as to who may be directing which. In other words, you know, when I think of Gonzalez and the trouble he's in right now, in perhaps influencing the judicial system to some degree, could you make some comment in that regard?
I could, but this is a good time to have a constitutional expert lawyer.
I'm not sure what influence.
Well, I think I know what he says, and I don't want to insult another Australian. What it is, but we have a little excuse. Well, I don't have much because I studied a lot of this, but maybe citizens have less excuse. There are many, many people in this country, I believe, have very little idea of how the government works. Very little idea. We were talking at lunchtime about the Second Amendment. You know, it's all big stuff now since Virginia Tech, you know, the gun rights and all the rest. We know that there's people that think that they have every right to carry a gun, and that argument has its own logic because it's been carried for so long. But most people just ignore the Second Amendment. It says, I haven't memorized the whole thing, but in relation to guns, it says the role of a, what's the words, I even forgot it, of a well-regulated militia. That's the reason given in the Second Amendment for guns. And the argument that's carried forward today has zero to do with militia. It has everything to do with gun nuts in urban situations that want assault rifles in their basement. So if you went back to the Constitution, it would be it seems to me, a relatively easy argument, except that we're now so far down into the woods that no one can figure it out. And I listened since 9/11 almost every day to people calling in on C-SPAN and these other talk radios. And it amazes me the level of ignorance about how the country works. I don't know what the fault is, whether the schools are not educating people or people are just so busy with other things it's drifted out of their mind. But that makes me fearful because you know, democracy is not a self-evident, self-sustaining idea. It remains to people to reconvince themselves of its principles, know the particulars, or else we are sitting ducks for anything, including right now. Did you know that a faction surrounding the president have advanced the idea? Attorney General Gonzalez even admitted to it in his confirmation that the president is not bound by the laws of Congress. That would be news to everybody of the Continental Congress. There would have been a riot there if they ever thought that could have come about. But that's where we're living through, and it's facilitated by people that aren't going to take to task public officials that advance basically revolutionary ideas, not even reactionary, just plain revolutionary ideas that are playing fast and loose with your freedoms. And there's three branches of government. I guess if I ever get kicked out of Liberty, I could teach government in school. You know, we have three branches of government, and if you read the Constitution as well as the Federalist Papers, which was part of the debate carried on with Hamilton and others over just the rationale for this whole government, you can see very clearly what they designed. They were trying to set up a very ineffective, complicated, slow-moving government. I mean, I'm putting a pejorative description on it, but basically they wanted to hamper every role of government so it couldn't take off on its own and become dictatorial. Even in the presidential election, which there are many ways of seeing the election of 2000 as highly irregular, not the least of which the Supreme Court taking an act in it. But the Constitution gives all sorts of procedures to deal with deadlocks and so on. And one that nobody seemed to mention in 2000, it just amazed me. If it's insoluble, if for whatever reason, you know, a voted deadlock or whatever, the Electoral College are under zero obligation to vote for the person that put them there. They could sit down in the room according to the Constitution, and it could have been Gore and Bush, and they could have elected, they could have just say, well, it's going to be the Speaker of the House, Kerry or whatever. How many of you know that? It's amazing that things have just drifted away. And we have these three branches, the executive, which is the presidential, and remember, just about everybody in the executive except the president are his cronies that he's nominated, and then they have to be endorsed by the Senate and so on. But he's really the head of the executive. There's the legislative, the Senate, and the House of Representatives, which is a way to create a tension between legislative so things can't get through too easily. It was a way to balance population density with geographic size. So again, it's to diffuse power, and they pass legislation. The president has to sign off on it. He can veto it, send it back. They can override it if they get a 2/3 majority. So there's systems here to exercise power, but in a diffuse, I was going to use the word lethargic, but slow-moving but inexorable way. If either the president's actions by executive order, and hardly anybody before 9/11 seemed to be aware of this, an incredible loophole, if you ask me, in the constitutional separation of powers. By executive order, the president can pretty much do anything he wants. But the Supreme Court can rein him in, and the legislature can pass laws counteracting that, but they both operate much more slowly, so executive orders can come out daily. But the Supreme Court, dealing with issues that come up through the legal system in appeals and insoluble or things that get deadlocked and so on, they move on up. Supreme Court can, by deciding on these or on a major legislation in itself, they can head it back or thwart it or whatever. So the three of them operate in a certain tension. And to be sure, we have the tension now, but I think there's been some flip-flops in the relative power. And my personal view of what we're living through is you can put a lot of it back to Watergate, that era. In the post-Watergate era, I believe the right-wing reactionary / religious emphasis, moral emphasis, that's been growing ever since. Certain damage was done to some of the institutions in Watergate that we're just seeing reflected now. And perhaps above it all, remember, as I said this morning, this is a human institution. In spite of Justice Scalia, who's a very entertaining person to hear, as well as an in-your-face Roman Catholic, which is his right, but yet a scary right exercise. One of his favorite points to shock people is he says that, we don't care what English law is, we don't care about any other law, forget it, it's irrelevant. Well, it's not really irrelevant, because Thomas Jefferson, when he was discussing some issues for this new republic, referenced English common law very regularly. And there's no question, you'd have to be naive to history to not see our whole structure here and the legal assumptions as being a continuum from the British legal practice. That's the pond that we swim in, there's no question. But I really wish people would look more closely at it. But the point that I was trying to make here, it's a civil institution that has a long history, but it's a human institution. And it's not a hard thing to show from history that there's a certain natural lifespan to all political structures. They either change and morph, which this has done several times, or, and maybe eventually anyhow, they pass away. The American Republic is not necessarily a system that on human terms will last forever. It's amazing in some ways that it's lasted so long, and on another level of judgment, it's not lasted nearly as long as you think. Remember, 1776 was when it was begun to be formed. The Constitution was ratified, what was it, about 10 years later, wasn't it? No, yeah. What year was that? It was 18. No, the ratification of the Constitution itself was about 10 years later. Anyhow, so even then, if you define the country, it was a little later than the one you think of. Then the War of 1812, this country nearly went under. That was a very dicey time for the U.S. Washington was pillaged. The president fled. People forget that. Then the Civil War is only like 40 years later, 50 years later. And that was a deep threat and a realignment, and a lot of our religious liberty arguments. I thought so for years, and I'm finally convinced that at root, that's our weak spot. A lot of our religious liberty arguments that hinge on the separation of church and state from the federal mandate cannot be supported pre-Civil War. There's no question that they intended the states to have roles that they do not now have. But the facts are now the states are not sovereign. They have to obey federal law, and federal law mandates separation of church and state in the First Amendment. I've lived through the era of the weathermen and all that stuff. In the 60s and 70s, this country was trembling on the brink. And we're in the process of moving to a whole new model. And if you read the writings of some of the people that are bringing in these new philosophies, it's called the unified principle of executive power. I'm getting the name. The unified theory of executive power. They have a dim view of the future, and it doesn't connect very well, in my view, with the founding intention. We're moving, if you want to use a nasty word, because no word is absolutely relevant, but we're moving to a structure that is far more what's the word? I must be getting tired. No, and it's not a theocracy. Theocracy is coming as a byproduct, but it's basically a fascist structure. And remember what fascism is. Everyone thinks Mussolini. They think ally to Hitler, which, that's a historical fact. But fascism in its classic sense is an elevation to the elements of power, the instruments of power, the institutions of power, that those are the points of reverence and of projecting of power in an impersonal statist sense, where there's a hard-line treatment of individuals as just minions of the state organism. And I think if I describe it like that, you see it's happening. And it's sort of a byproduct of modernization, of expanding civilization, of an absolute determination of business interests, and as even the documents that inform the Constitution, saying life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That happiness was a popularist twist on it. It was really the pursuit of property. The United States capitalist system was always premised on respecting property and property rights and business interest. And that was why, and I'm giving you a civics lesson in a way here, that was why it didn't trouble the framers so much to disadvantage slaves and others, because they were not in the propertied class. There was not a contradiction to their philosophy. They were blinding themselves to the humanity of the situation, but it was not inconsistent with the logic of where the power resided in this new republic. Another question, because I've gotten far afield.
Yes, there's a question regarding the interpretation you're using in the Constitution as you go back and forth between the first and the second, and it seems like you're going back and forth in relationship to the reading of it being an originalist or not. And so I'm just questioning, on what time do you decide to be an originalist, and what time do you decide not to be an originalist as you look at both of those amendments?
There's more in that question than probably most of you realize. And in a way, I don't like the way she expressed it at first. We're only talking about one constitution. There's the Constitution, which even as it was adopted, came automatically as a condition of its acceptance with some amendments. Don't think the First Amendment was after the fact. It was part of accepting the Constitution. And there's only been one Constitution. It's never been changed. It's been amended. And as the terms you're bringing up are the ones most bandied around by Justice Scalia. I've heard him in person a couple of times, and I've listened to him many times. That's his thing. He claims to be an originalist. And that's a loaded discussion. And all historians have problems with that, because if you're an originalist, you've got two options, and he sort of mixes the two. You either go absolutely by the text itself and analyze it for what the words say and nothing more, which is quite difficult, especially with this Constitution, because it's very spare. I read you the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law establishing religion. You know, there's a gazillion cases on that. So you either go on the exact words, or as Scalia really does, in spite of all of his protestations, you get back into the mind of those that lived there and try to divine their intention. Now, on the face of it, that seems easy. That's just a matter of history. But those are dead people. The society is long gone, and it becomes a very subjective exercise, and the religious right have been adept at this, going back into the past and projecting their own wishes and their own agenda onto history. And it's fairly easy to do because, like I say, apocryphal stories of George Washington, you know, kneeling, this is before the Constitution, of course, but kneeling in some battle and then making a statement about God and so on. Well, you know, that then suddenly is projected on some legal document. But the best thing we can do on original intent, if you want to look at the context, is the debate that they had in the Federalist Papers and some of the public statements by Madison and others. But go further afield than that, you're really into psychohistory. And if you look at the text alone, I think it's not that unclear, and Scalia himself gives the argument, but Adventists should be wary of this. He says if the Constitution itself says this and you want to do something different and the wording doesn't allow for it, he says rather than, and he mocks the Supreme Court, which is interesting, his own peers, he says rather than a living Constitution where you sort of make up things in agreement with what you see as the principles, he says no, he says you change the Constitution by amendments. And most people have forgotten that, except the religious right who are seeking a marriage amendment. That's a legitimate constitutional method. But I grew up with Adventists being very suspicious about constitutional amendments. Once you open the process, it's very likely, in fact almost certain, that beyond, say, the marriage amendment, which is in itself a little problematic, you probably have other things. And in the context we're in now, it's not a far stretch to see some amendment on some moral issue, perhaps even a day of worship.
Yeah, I have a question. Earlier this morning, I heard you mention, and you said that besides what we hear about the young generation, that the young generation is not prepared to uphold the gospel and to lead us on. Now,
well, it was a generalization that can be ruined by any exception.
Right.
But I know from the perspective of the General Conference, of seeing what's going, as well as being in the publishing houses where they're trying to raise money, we have not linked in any satisfactory way with the next generations. They're not monetarily supporting, they're not numerically supporting, and so on. But yeah, there's many exceptions.
Well, I've had the opportunity to be raised by my grandmother, which is an older generation, and she's not from the baby boomers generation, which I feel raised us. And if there's any problem, then I feel that that generation should take more of a blame. But I believe that prophecy of God, that he says that he will raise a generation to send this gospel. So when you say that, what are you basing it on, just in that we are not supporting, or?
I didn't say it couldn't happen. I believe it has to somehow. But we needn't fool ourselves that it's not yet happened. And my personal view, which I think I threw out, is that right now it's illogical that we've gone this long since September 11 without a couple of other radical pieces falling into place. I just have to believe God's holding it back. And what's he waiting for? It might seem sort of self-serving and introspective for Adventists, but I just have to believe that he's waiting for us to answer to the moment. And there's a certain irony on that. A lot of Adventists don't want trouble, so they think they keep quiet. And to some degree, I think God's waiting, but he won't wait forever. But I'm sure if we speak out, I'm quite sure that in this country alone, forget some other countries, if we started really getting on fire and proclaiming, not combatively or anything, but just saying loudly in a way that gets public attention what we believe, I believe we'll have trouble. Big trouble, but also we'll catch attention. Think about the Davidian thing in Mount Carmel. No, we don't believe what they believe. They're off the beam. But in a few hours, the entire country, if not the whole world, is watching what's happening there, and people on talk programs are analysing and discussing what they're doing. Greatest thing that ever happened to get their idea across, or get more at hand. Islam. Islam's been in the US from the very beginning, not many, and they're increasing by immigration and so on. But 9/11, you would think, would be the worst news for Islam in this country possible. I mean, Muslims fly into the buildings, and we were arresting them here, there, and the other with radical views, wanting to slice heads off and so on. Islam never had it so good in the US. People are converting at an unprecedented rate in the United States to Islam. The books on Islam are racing out of the bookstores. So we have it from God and a prophetic promise, but I think just a matter of cause and effect, how it works, it will be the most wonderful thing for the proclamation of what we believe if we woke up and caused problems. Because right now, net whatever and all the rest, we don't really have great potential with our own resources from a human potential to do all that we want to do, and God's promise to help with His Spirit, I believe, when a moment comes. But just the way things work humanly, we should look up and see that the communication is given an incredible potential to get it out quickly if we latch onto that mechanism. Anyhow, that's what.
We know that...
I've calmed down a lot now. Years ago, I used to give a sermon called the Revolutionary Sermon. and I just still think, Ellen White says it, agitate, agitate, agitate. We've become status quo church. There's no two ways about it.
We know that separation of church and state is built on the U.S. Constitution. And we also know that, generally speaking, once you leave the borders of the U.S., you don't have that. You may have religious freedom. Now, since it's based primarily on the Constitution, do you try to defend this from a biblical basis?
Well, when is this guy going to let me off the hook? Yes, our religious liberty group always have, and I don't think it's that hard as long as you explain the theocracy adequately. No one in their right mind, understanding the full implications, would try to ever draw a model for the United States anything like a theocracy. Who's the voice of God? Or who's the prophet that informs, this Christian republic? So I think we can easily set aside the Old Testament theocracy and then make a good argument for the Bible on the separation of church and state, mostly in Jesus' own words. Of separate spheres, and render unto Caesar what is Caesar, and unto God what is God's. I think it's biblical. It's not the only model that will facilitate freedom of Christian practice, obviously. Like England. I can argue that England is just as free for religious freedom as here, but they have an established church. But we give a good argument historically and logically in Religious Liberty Department that an established church, even if it doesn't subvert itself into something like the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages where it's using the state to persecute its enemies, as it now exists in England, it basically innovates the state church and turns it into a cipher. It's got no spiritual strength, no initiative. It ruins a church to have that sort of patronage. But as far as Adventists operating in England, yes, I don't think they're no more restricted than here, and arguably maybe more. Where I could argue that there's maybe even more religious freedom is in Australia, which doesn't have an established church but has almost a dislike of religion. It's a very secular country, and they've got a good constitution that keeps the government out of religious business, and things work pretty good. But historically, what I would say is Australia, like a lot of other Western and even some non-Western countries, have modeled their constitution after the United States. And Seventh-day Adventists always hark to the United States because we see this as prophetically significant. What happens here is really the central battleground in matters of conscience right through Sunday laws and the persecution. And we also know that while the US doesn't lead in some of the ways that it imagines anymore. It's still a huge enough structure that most of the world is watching it, modeling social and other behaviors after it. And when this country drops its constitutional inhibitions and adopts the Sunday law, you can guarantee it'll just go all over the world very quickly. So it's important what happens here, and it's important to hold a line on the Constitution and hold this country to its own claims. Now, you're right, to a point, I think what you're implying. If you live in Russia, or lived in communist Russia, they didn't even allow that religions should exist. So you're going to argue separation of church and state and the constitutional models we have here? It's not appropriate. And I believe at the end of the day, a Christian does what they do because God asks them to, and you don't grant the state any authority in that area. Our guard is down here because from the very beginning, American Christians and now Adventists in that continuum, we thoroughly confuse worship of God and loyalty to the state. It's just bound up together here in a way that it's not bad in good times. But when the state asks something improper of you, we have no inhibition here to resist. And this issue of young men going into the military is case in point. I just told you before, we're in a current situation where every single young person in the military is in a position where it's essentially impossible for them to keep Sabbath and their other convictions routinely. I'm not saying one Sabbath they won't get it, but they have no legal guarantee of it, and it's just unheard of that they will get a free pass through their term of service in a volunteer army. I don't hear Adventists worrying about it. In fact, what I hear is routine statements of support for the troops at the General Conference, worships that extol what we're doing and so on. We've just straight together. Might as well put the swastika over the cross as far as I'm concerned. It's not as pernicious, but it's the same dynamic. And so I think the test is going to be greater for North American Adventists than someone living out of Mongolia or Thailand or somewhere. They don't expect the state to be advancing their religious views. We've made an assumption, and we've been blessed by God for generations where we didn't have to worry about the state. But one day, according to prophecy and just according to the logic of history, it will ask of you something you are not, by heaven's mandate, to give. Just two more questions, and I think we should wind up.
Could you comment?
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Could you comment on the topic of hate speech and where we are in the country now? I know Canada has adopted very vigorous rules on that, and pastors aren't allowed to just speak what some consider to be hate speech from the pulpit. Are we headed that direction? Are we even talking about it in our church? Is this an issue?
Complicated. I can still hear my mother who's alive and my father who died last year razzing me after hearing these afternoon meetings. You talk too long on answers, she said. But there's so much in it. When the first US hate legislation came up, I was really against it. And as I remember, am I right, Charles? A number of our religious liberty people weren't so bothered by it when the first hate crimes legislation that came up, what was about 5-6 years ago? There was a split decision within the PAL group. They didn't see the problem, but from the beginning it bothered me. And we do have some hate speech legislation, or hate crimes. And I don't know if Charles wants to say, but I picked up the other day either a passage or a promotion of some new bill from was it from Texas? Anyhow, there's some more bubblings up legislatively here. But England is way ahead of the US with good cause, because they have radical Muslims in London particularly who are saying stuff that would just curl your hair. I've even seen video footage shown by different people, including a woman in the House of Lords under our sponsorship came to Washington recently and showed footage I think it was in the Finsbury Mosque where what do you call them? Veterans from the Afghan war were standing up front and telling the membership how to erect barrage balloons on the approach to Heathrow Airport. Barrage balloons, buying war surplus or surplus balloons and putting grenades in the rigging and so on. You know, that's incredible stuff. So they've since deported one of those imams under that law, where he was spreading hate and violence. So England's gone along with it. But both the English law is really aimed at terrorist/religious expression. The American laws, at least in the early cases, were aimed more at racially inspired and/or some acts against Jews and so on. We're within the domestic context of just hate activity. I'm not really sure that you could claim that the U.S. laws are connected to the wider terrorism issue. The laws in Canada are very narrowly targeted because of homosexual rights. And yeah, we've had a few articles about this, and a judge in Canada has given a legal opinion, no case yet, that just to repeat without comment some of the Bible texts on homosexuality and so on, or to print them publicly and so on, is a civil offence. You don't have to make a comment. In Australia, they have some hate speech legislation, religious hate speech, and they convicted an evangelist recently, although, as I understand, the sentence ended up suspended. But he was giving an evangelistic campaign about Islam, and he had quotes from the Quran on one side and quotes on the Bible on the other, and he was showing the distinctions. And in the audience, a Muslim guy jumped up, challenged him, they got into an altercation, and it went to court. And the judge said it was not necessary that he had to have said anything wrong at all. The mere fact that offense was taken was caused to be punished under this clause. And I know that in ongoing negotiations that our Church Religious Liberty Department at the General Conference level have with many religious groups, Catholics, Lutherans, and so on, they're routinely discussing proselytization, conversions from one group to the other. And I think we're putting our head in the noose because under the guise of establishing rules of good behavior, they're actually establishing inhibitions against sharing your faith and speaking against some other religion, because it's not acceptable anymore to say something, say to a Catholic or a Muslim, that they take offense at. And if you're explaining a belief that you see errors in, they're going to take offense. You don't have to be offensive to the human being. It's inherently offensive. You could put a bit better construction, but if you want to convert someone, you've got to convince them that they've believed in error. And most of the major churches don't want that anymore. As I said, I think earlier, the Muslim cleric from Iran said that the time for conversions is over. The PLO representative the other day, while he gave a long explanation of how Christians are not harassed in Palestine or in PLO area, he said it is unacceptable to try to convert a Muslim to Christianity or a Christian to Muslim. Finished. And that's one of the underlying dynamics all around the world. We were in Sri Lanka just over a year ago, and they've passed an anti-conversion law there. And if you bring coercive measures to bear to convert someone, and that's very subjective. What's coercion? Just to someone feels they're being pushed that way. You could be imprisoned for life or even a death penalty. These things are popping up everywhere because, and I didn't give you my set speech, I rambled at the beginning trying to make it shorter, ironically, but I believe the entire world is moving into a new phase of structure for countries. We went through the isms, communism, and we still like to think about capitalism, but it's not as popular as it used to be. It's self-determination has really replaced that. But what's happening all around the world, if you really look at it and see it through this light, the old nationalism, the old empires are passing, and more people are in groupings that are from two aspects, and usually one is dominant, ethnic and religious. Religion is how they define themselves in a larger entity. But if there's a break on that, then it starts to break along ethnic lines. But religious affiliation has become a national marker. And in Russia, for example, that's exactly what we're seeing. The Eastern Orthodox Church reasserted itself as the Church of Russia. And it's got favorite status, and it is unambiguously saying that they are the nation. And that, again, that doesn't bode very well for religious freedom, and hints at the sort of things that we're seeing in the US, where in some way, and it's going to be harder in the US, we're just a huge mixture of ethnic groups and of just a gazillion polyglot religions. But there could easily be, from what's developing now, a sort of a state coalition of acceptable, mainline, bland groups that have a very strong political agenda, but doctrines all tamped down. And this is why this coalition of Protestants and Catholics can come together. They're not talking about doctrine beyond the markers, anti-abortion and so on. One more question. I'll even promise it'll be a short answer.
No one else had one. One more thought. You talking about, see if I can bring my thought back, that we've gotten used to the government sort of, maybe the idea in America, our government is so good that they know what to do, and if I vote correctly, I'll still have my religious freedom. But if you go back to the original arguments about the amendments and the Constitution, there was a debate, which is wonderful to read about, between the words religious toleration and religious freedom. And in there you can see where the toleration clause was from the great benevolent government, who said, well, we think differently, but we'll tolerate your religion. And they said, no, it needs to be religious freedom.
Well, that's a standard principle that we talk about in the Religious Liberty Department. Toleration is probably preferable to persecution, but when you're setting up a legal model, toleration is not a very good way to be, because toleration can mean that you're not liked, you're not really accepted, but you will be allowed under certain accommodations as long as you keep quiet, and as long as the operative power and society deign to let you exist, you'll exist. But it's just one step removed from active negative attitude towards you. Toleration is not good. The religious freedom principles that the U.S. has advanced, that derive from the Constitution, have always emphasized that everyone has the right to believe what they want to believe or not to believe, and that they should not be troubled in any way as they hold those beliefs. That's not toleration. That's, what does the Bible say? Something about... it's a text that I thought of. It's anyhow, thinking well of each other and flipped into my mind. But basically, the other person is as worthy of consideration as you are, and their views have as much weight as yours, even though clearly on religion you believe yours is right. But you have to grant that from their perspective they think the same, and that's worthy of respect. You don't demean it as they do in Northern Ireland. If you're a Catholic, those so-and-so Protestants. We don't want to marginalize it like that. Charles has been very benign with me, as he always is, but I've got to conclude by just reminding you of a couple of pieces of legislation that are fairly important for Adventists. At the moment, our church is still sticking with a project that's taken, at a guess, I'd say at least 4 years, where we're part of a coalition of mostly religious groups, but a few civil rights groups, promoting a piece of legislation called the Workplace Religious Freedom Act. We feel that this is needed now. Maybe I'll start it back a little bit further. In 1996, I think it was, there was legislation proposed by another coalition called the was it RFRA or RILPRA? RFRA went first. Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And this was designed to not so much change the law, but change the way the law was applied. Even though I mentioned the Constitution, in some ways in the workplace, your greatest freedom or your greatest leverage to protect your inherent freedom comes from Title VII of the Civil Rights legislation, which says you can't be discriminated against on the basis not only of race or gender or disability, but of religion. So that's been very good all through the years. But it's turned out that, especially in the workplace, but in other areas of societies, this right and this allowance, while it's there, you have to prove the point. You have to argue over all sorts of inhibitions with the employer. You have to convince them why they should give this to you, rather than it being the default setting. And so this first piece of legislation, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, was designed to make it the default setting. It actually passed through Congress and the Senate and then was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. And I don't hold it against the Supreme Court because I think they were right. The reason they did that, it was piggybacked onto the right of the federal government to regulate interstate commerce. So it was sort of a rude way to force something on the states. So after that, the same coalition put forward the Religious Liberty Protection Act, and this was around 2000, as I remember, which got through Congress, or was it 99? It must have been 99 because it came undone because of the change in administration. It went through Congress and then stalled. So for the last few years, our church in the same coalition, and our church takes a leading position. James Standish is the co-chair of this group of a coalition of about 30-some groups, 30-some entities. It's now called the Workplace Religious Freedom Act, and it's more narrowly targeted just to the workplace. But that's where most of the problems are. And it's designed to make the default setting that you get accommodation. Right now, the way the legal precedent is established, if you have a problem with accommodation, your employer, the way it usually goes to law, only is under obligation to make some effort to accommodate you. And it can be as small as, say, $1 worth of value. The legal term is de minimis. It's close to English. Minimal, nothing, almost nothing. So even in a bigger accommodation than $1, if they gave you one Sabbath off but then no more, they'd be off the hook. And we want it to be that the law applies and they need to show why they cannot give it to you. Still may be cases where they won't, but at least the logic is reversed. We've been pushing on this for a long time. It's got bipartisan support. Senator Kerry, for example, is behind it on the Democrats. Senator Santorum, who's out since the last election, he was with it. There's quite a few on both sides, lesser known people that support it. But importantly, the Association of Businesses seems to be against it, and the gay lobby are against it because they claim that this will diminish their rights in the workplace. We don't understand how, but they're not a good enemy to have at the moment. So you need to pray that this will go through. We've had hearings in Congress already, which is usually close to the thing being put forward, but it hasn't yet been put to the House. At this stage, it's probably less likely than not, but nothing's lost yet. It's still hasn't run itself out, and we need this very bad. Another piece of legislation that passed a while back that's had good ramifications is the Religious Land Use and Institutional Workers Act. And that was a good piece of legislation because it headed off to some degree the problems that many Adventists and other religious groups were having in zoning regulations. And of course, they're not over yet. And since that was passed, the Supreme Court, in one of their quirkier decisions, upheld the right of a township to take over property on eminent domain. And so there's some inherent power that remains with local government to play fast and loose with property and the ways property is used. And we can just pray that works out. One of the more interesting cases that our church has had for a long time was a case with the Vacaville, California church that wanted to have a radio station on their grounds. And oh man, they went through the grill. And as I remember, they finally got it belatedly, but I think now after getting it, they're in danger of losing it because the church is being sold. Isn't that the latest situation? Yeah, I think so. There's some change. But anyhow, we benefited slightly from the the Religious Land Use and Institutional Workers Act, which was passed while this case was ongoing. And I alluded to a couple of Supreme Court cases. I'm not a lawyer, and I wish this lawyer would come up and add something to this. But the way I would characterize it is there are many cases going through the lower courts and then some to the Supreme Court that have tangential influence on religious issues. Most of them are not clearly and obviously a religious issue, but there are always unintended, or you could say intended consequences, because I'm sure that some people in a Machiavellian way figure out if they get this, something will flow from it. But I do think a lot of the problems with religious practice that usually relate to how churches and church institutions operate have byproduct things. It's only now and then that there's a full frontal thing, like the one I mentioned, where the Jehovah's Witnesses challenged all the way to the Supreme Court efforts by local government to restrict their ability and ours to witness door to door. You know, that's such a basic thing. There are many cases involving or not so many Supreme Court, but there are many legal things that are going on relating to posting religious symbols and so on. And beware of that part of it, because to me that's become a playground of ideologues, because it's not always what it appears to be. And even when it is what it appears to be, like someone sent me a letter the other day, an Adventist woman, about her daughter at school, at a public school, at lunchtime, had a prayer session with a couple of friends, and the police were actually called in, and they were escorted off the school, and it was forbidden. Well, that's a true story, but it has almost no relevance on the law. That's the sort of thing that the religious right put in their fundraising letters. And all that is an overzealous, incorrect school administration, because by law, as the Clinton administration tried to explain to people while they were in power by sending out a booklet, there is no restriction to religious expression by private individuals, even in public environments. The restrictions so far have been, as they should be, have been on the school administration and the school representatives in that role of authority in organizing and even or restricting religious activity. And also, a huge jump of logic is made with a lot of people. They think when they read that the Ten Commandments have been taken down somewhere, you know, the religion's restricted here and you can't display the Ten Commandments. You can put, you know, row after row of Ten Commandment displays on your front. Well, I'm going to say you can, but maybe there'd be zoning things about eyesore. But essentially, you can do it. These are always talking about on public property with public money and with the authority and the imprimatur of government. And even the ones that want it, like Roy Jones, Roy Moore, rather. Roy Moore wanting, you know, his granite monument at his courthouse. He was quite specific, and adamantly so, that he never would allow a stone with a little quote from the Quran or you know, some other religious text, the Bhagavad Gita. So, you know, anybody that's thinking this through should realize he's just as dangerous, even though he happens to share your Christian faith, as someone who would be adamantly opposed to your faith and would want to restrict you. And I wish I could remember the quote. I keep bringing it up in the afternoon, but one of the American framers of the Constitution, and I think it was it Madison, said, you know, the idea that one sect could gain some control of government is problematic, but if they can do that, they can just as easily exclude all other sects. And that's the nature of sects, S-E-C-T-S. One last thing I need to tell you about, because I think it's the biggest danger that I know of coming down the legislative track at the moment. And I haven't read about it for a couple of weeks, but I know every year for the last 4 or 5 years there's been considerable discussion about a proposed bill called either the Jones Bill or the Religious Houses of Worship Act. D. James Kennedy is a prime one that's pushing it out of Coral Gables. I know Dobson's pushing it. It's pretty much the love child of the religious right. And the Religious Houses of Worship Act, under the guise of, as Kennedy says, unbinding the church, let it speak freely. They want this legislation, which, in spite of the fact that we've seen campaign finance reform laws that limit contributions and have accountability for money and so on, would allow the churches to keep their non-profit status, tax exempt, and they would be allowed to raise unlimited monies for political activities. They would have unlimited rights to allow politicians to stand in the pulpit and promote their views. The pastor could promote and push any party view or any political candidate. You could use this unlimited money to take out television ads, newspaper ads, any media, letter, writings, just absolute open go with unlimited money potential to be raised to promote party and party interests and individual politicians. And apart from it being clearly unconstitutional, just as a procedural matter, it should be obvious to anyone outside their little self-serving clique that's pushing this, that if this were to happen, where churches would, and big churches would essentially become big political action centers, just like with the political parties, there will be big winners and big losers. And the big winners will in various ways victimize and marginalize the losers. So it would lead very quickly to some prejudicial actions from one church to the other, and probably endorsed by the state. And then linking one other avenue, then I'll shut up. Remember, the Office of Faith-Based Initiative that this president has established, apart from being arguably unconstitutional and showing great favoritism to certain religious interests, almost automatically necessitates that in all of their offices, and they have them in all departments of government, they have to have a list of what churches are acceptable to run the money through. It's already been said that Nation of Islam, for example, no. So and we've talked to some of their reps and they sort of acknowledge it grudgingly. Once the government has a list, a hierarchical list of this church is safe, this one's safe, not so much, this is off the list. That translates and has in many other countries very rapidly to the way that the government looks upon that church in a wide variety of things, not just giving funds, but whether they're patriotic, whether they're safe, whether they're American, you name it. So, as I said before, things are coming together, and while one little avenue, it may not be the end of the world, when linked to another, you can see the lay of the land. Thanks very much for listening to me, and I'm sorry I always talk too long. And thank you for coming along. And if we didn't cover some of the questions today, please read Liberty Magazine. Go to our website. It's libertymagazine.org. And I'm not paid by James, who our division is deputized to head up the North American Religious Liberty Association, which we've resurrected. This is our membership aspect of religious liberty for the division. But he has a site it's really tied up to his job more, but you'll find legislative news there called OLA, Office of Legislative Affairs, OLA.org. And you'll find very interesting stuff there. And what's the NALA site? Do you remember? Yeah, .freedom. Try religiousliberty.freedom. It doesn't sound. But Liberty has a lot of resource material, and the OLA site has government legislative action. I think between those two, you'll be off on the right track. And then do like we do, you can web surf, but don't believe everything else you see. There's just an amazing amount of bizarre stuff out there. Every wind of doctrine is blowing, and every political view, especially on the web, it gets some sort of credibility just because it's in print. But remember what we've been told. I'm just more and more convinced that yes, we're Bible-based, but having this Bible as a given. Seventh-day Adventists have been privileged to have a word from God through a prophet that endorses the Bible but particularizes those things for our day. And Ellen White has explained what would happen in this country. And maybe someone here has got something I've missed, but I don't see anything she said that's been disproven by current events. It's the other way around. Like even on the tsunami. Scientists have known about tsunamis for a long time, but the popular consciousness is was a shock, was it 2-3 years ago? But there's a quote Ellen White says about end-time events. She says, the ocean overflows its boundaries. Amazing statements, and that one that I read this morning. But remember the key one on the issues we've been talking about. She says it's the people that will agitate to the legislators to pass Sunday laws, and they will give in to it. My view is, and this is what I try in Liberty Magazine, it's fine to head back legislation by some massive lobbying effort, which we can't really do anyhow. I think the key to these things, the key to proclaiming freedom, to protecting freedom, is to work with society. If society's attitudes are fine, if they understand freedom, in a way it doesn't much matter what the laws are. But if society changes on you, any law is possible, any attack on God's law. So our obligation, I think, is to talk liberty to our friends, to our community, and in our role as citizens, certainly write to your legislator, communicate to them. You know, that's not even close to the same as the religious right are doing, where they give out voter registration or voter lists of how the legislators voted and what we should do. We're not doing that at all. But you know the issues. And we have an obligation, I believe, to inform those that represent us. Tell them. And James Standish has pointed out many times the obvious, but most people don't think about it. If a certain legislator gets 20, 30 emails or letters from someone, they pay attention. They don't get that many. And they'll think this is a massive response. It's the same with an editor. If I get 2 or 3 negatives on an issue, I'd pay attention, because you always figure there's sort of you never know the proportion, but there's a larger group out there that are holding the same view. So your voice will make a difference if you communicate to legislators. Thank you very much. I think 2 hours, or at least the best part of 2 hours, is long enough. Thank you for having me here, and I really appreciate it, and thank you for supporting Liberty Magazine. It's not the only thing we do, but on the magazine, remember, if you don't know, of the money that goes to Liberty, a percentage of it goes to the litigation fund, and a percentage of it goes to the unions to run the Religious Liberty Department. So it's well-used money. None of it goes to my salary or my travels. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's rise together. Father in heaven, please forgive us if complacency has described our activity. Give us a sense of discernment and help us to move forward and to inform ourselves as we should and to represent Christ as we should. May he be glorified, we pray in his name. Amen. Take advantage of that fresh air now.
Well, you stayed on by. Thank you.